Elias Voss woke up before the sun did. That was not by choice. It was simply the way his life worked. If he was not up before everyone else, he would not be allowed to eat. If he did not clean the kitchen before breakfast, someone would make sure he regretted it. So every morning, without fail, he rose in the dark, pulled on his worn shirt, and got to work. He was 22 years old and had spent most of his life inside the Shadow Vale Pack's territory, but he was not truly part of it. The pack tolerated him the way someone tolerates an old crack in the wall. They noticed it, they were annoyed by it, but they had grown used to it being there. Elias had no wolf. That was what everyone believed. In a world where every person born into a shifter pack carried a wolf spirit inside them, Elias was seen as empty, defective. The pack called him an omega, but not in the way the word was meant. They used it as an insult, a label for someone who had nothing and deserved nothing. The alpha of Shadow Vale was a man named Cain Dragor. Cain was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of face that always looked like it was waiting for someone to make a mistake. He ran the pack with an iron hand. He believed that strength was everything, and that anyone who could not show strength was a burden. Elias, in Cain's eyes, was the heaviest burden the pack carried. Every week, during the pack's formal assembly, Cain would make Elias stand in front of everyone. He would make him say the words out loud, that he carried no wolf, that he served by the pack's charity, that he was grateful for the roof over his head. Elias said the words every time, not because he believed them, but because he had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. He stood there each week, with his eyes down, his hands still, his face like stone. He said the words, then he went back to his corner of the pack house and kept going. It was something quieter than hope. It was simply the decision to continue, 1 hour, then the next, then the next. He did not dream of revenge. He did not spend his nights imagining the day things would change. He simply woke up, did what needed to be done, and went to sleep again. That was his life, and he had made a kind of peace with it. But the world had not made peace with him. One evening, after the assembly, Cain called Elias forward again. But this time, there was something different in his voice. Cain looked out at the gathered pack and announced, calmly and without emotion, that Elias would be formally cast out at the next full moon, not exiled with the traditional small provisions and a direction to walk. Cast out entirely, the pack bond severed, the territory closed to him, his name removed from the pack record. In the shifter world, the pack bond was not simply a social connection. It was a living thread that tied every member to the group. Without it, a person lost something essential, a warmth in the chest, a sense of belonging to something, a quiet hum of life that most people never even noticed until it was gone. Severing it was considered one of the harshest punishments possible. For someone without a wolf, Cain said, the result would simply come faster. Elias stood very still when he heard this. He did not react. He walked back to his corner of the pack house and sat on the edge of his narrow bed. He put his hands on his knees and stared at the floor for a long time. He was not afraid. That surprised him. He had expected fear, but what came instead was a strange, hollow calm, like the feeling just before a storm, when the air goes completely still. That night, one of Cain's enforcers, a broad young man named Ro, found Elias in the supply room. Ro had never liked Elias. He was the kind of person who felt more important when someone else felt small. He had pushed Elias, mocked him, cornered him a dozen times before. But that night, Ro was not interested in words. The beating was severe. Elias hit the cold stone floor and stayed there. His ribs ached sharply with every breath. His vision blurred at the edges. Ro stood over him, breathing hard, and then turned to leave. And then something happened that Elias could not explain. The room went cold, not cool, cold, the kind of cold that settles in bones. Every light above them flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, Ro froze. He did not know why. Some part of him that was older and wiser than his conscious mind was screaming at him to run. He could feel something in the room that had not been there a moment before, a presence, vast and impossibly heavy, like standing at the base of a mountain and suddenly becoming aware of its size. Elias got up from the floor. He rose slowly, and when he stood, something had changed. His eyes, always a dull and unremarkable gray, were now amber, bright, burning amber, ringed in silver around the edges. He did not look afraid. He did not look angry. He looked like someone who had simply remembered something very important. He looked at Ro and said one word: leave. His voice was different. It was still his voice, but there was something underneath it, a second tone, deep and resonant, as if the word had been spoken by two people at once. It pressed against the walls of the room. It pressed against Ro's chest like a hand. Ro ran. He did not stop running until he was on the far side of the territory, gasping in the open air, unable to explain what had just happened to him. Elias stood alone in the dark supply room, his ribs still aching, his eyes slowly returning to gray. He pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself. Something inside him felt like it had cracked open. Not broken, but opened. Like a door that had been locked for a very long time had just shifted on its hinges.
Hey!
He found Marin the next morning. Marin was the pack's healer, an elderly woman with silver hair and careful hands. She had always been kind to Elias in quiet, unspoken ways. An extra serving of food left on the counter, a salve left near his door without explanation. She was one of the very few people in Shadowvale who had ever treated him like a person. When he knocked on her door, she opened it immediately, as if she had been expecting him. She sat him down at her small table and looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she took a slow breath and began to tell him the truth. The Voss bloodline, she said, was not extinct. It was hidden. For 200 years, it had been passed quietly from parent to child, generation after generation, with the wolf inside each carrier, deliberately kept asleep, sealed by a blood oath sworn by her ancestor on the night the last Voss Alpha was killed. The oath was meant to protect whoever carried the bloodline from being detected and destroyed. The wolf would not stir, would not show itself, until the carrier was old enough and strong enough to survive what came with it. Elias listened without interrupting. He sat very still. Marin told him that the Voss bloodline was not the same as ordinary alpha blood. It was older than the current pack system. The first carriers of this bloodline were not simply dominant wolves. They were something that the old texts called alpha kings, people in whom the wolf and the human were so completely fused that they did not fight each other. They thought and acted with total clarity, and the wolves around them, all wolves, regardless of rank, felt it. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. The deep, instinctive recognition of something true. When she finished, Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Marin looked at her hands. "Because," she said softly, "an alpha king who comes into power before he understands what powerlessness feels like can become the very thing he was meant to replace. You needed to know what it costs people to have nothing. You needed to carry that knowledge before you carried anything else." Elias sat with that for a long time. He did not forgive her immediately, but he understood. That night was the full moon. Elias walked alone to the wide clearing at the center of Shadowvale's territory. It was the same ground where Cain held his ceremonies, the same ground where Elias had been made to kneel more times than he could remember. He stood in the middle of it and waited. The transformation, when it came, did not feel like what he had always imagined. He had seen other pack members shift, had watched the change move through them like a wave, their bodies reshaping, the wolf rising. He had always assumed it was painful, violent even. For Elias, it was like exhaling after holding his breath for 22 years. The wolf that stepped forward was unlike anything the pack had ever seen. It was enormous, built long and powerful, with fur that was silver white except for a pattern of dark markings along the jaw and flank, markings that the older wolves would later identify from ancient texts as the crest of the Voss line. The wolf raised its head to the night sky and released a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a call, but something between the two, something ancient and certain. The sound traveled through the air, but it also traveled through something else, something unseen. It moved through the pack bond that connected every wolf in Shadowvale to every other wolf. It reached into their chests and pressed against something they had not known was there. In the pack house, Wolves stirred from sleep without knowing why. Several sat up in bed, disoriented. A few found themselves on their feet before they were fully awake. One elder, a woman who had been in the pack for 60 years, began to cry. She could not have explained why if someone had asked her. It simply felt, she said later, like something lost had finally come home. Cain stood at his window. His grip tightened on the frame until the wood cracked. In. By morning, the pack house was charged with a tension that no one quite knew how to name. Cain moved quickly. He called an emergency assembly and announced that a rogue threat had entered their territory overnight. He used careful language. He spoke about the importance of pack security. He did not say Elias's name, but everyone knew. Elias arrived at the assembly on his own. He walked in from the eastern path, still in his human form, wearing the same worn clothes he always wore. He did not look like a king. He did not carry himself with performance or drama. He simply walked in and stood in the center of the clearing, the same spot where he had always been made to stand when Cain wanted to remind everyone of his place. Something shifted in the air the moment he stopped moving. It was subtle. The wolves nearest to him straightened without realizing it. Two of Cain's senior enforcers exchanged a look. Dax, who had stood at Cain's right side for 3 years, took one slow step to the left, and then kept walking, quietly, until he was standing behind Elias. Cain's jaw tightened. He pointed at Elias and addressed the pack loudly. "This man is a danger. What happened last night was not natural. I will not allow." "May I speak?" Elias said. His voice was not loud. He did not shout over Cain. He simply asked the question. And somehow the question settled over the assembly, like a hand pressing gently on a table to ask for quiet. People stopped moving. People stopped murmuring. Cain said nothing, and in that silence, Elias spoke. He did not speak about power. He did not challenge Cain directly or list the things that had been done to him. He talked about the pack. He talked about the members who worked the hardest and ate the least. He talked about the young wolves who were afraid to ask questions. He talked about what a pack was actually for, not to serve its leader, but to protect every single person inside it, from the strongest to the most vulnerable. He said, "A pack is only as strong as how it treats the person at the bottom. I have been at the bottom. I know exactly how strong this pack is, and I know exactly what it could be instead." He stopped speaking. The clearing was completely silent. More than half the wolves had turned, without realizing it, to face him fully. Not Cain, Elias. The way plants turn toward light, not because someone told them to, but because something in their nature simply responded. Cain made his move. He had no other option left, and they both knew it. The confrontation was short. Cain was a powerful alpha, genuinely strong, genuinely skilled. Under different circumstances, it would have been a difficult fight. But dominance is not only physical, it lives in the bond between a leader and the people who follow him, and in that moment, the bond was gone. The pack had already decided, in the quiet language of turned bodies and averted eyes, where they stood. Cain could feel it, the withdrawal of their energy, the absence of that invisible current that had always run between an alpha and his pack. He fought without that current. He was only a man. When it was over, Elias held him down, not with cruelty, not with any desire to humiliate. He held him down until Cain stopped fighting. Then he leaned close and said, quietly, so only Cain could hear, "You never led. You only prevented. There is a difference." He released him and stepped back. Low. Cain left Shadowvale that same afternoon. He chose to go, which was the only real choice Elias gave him. He could stay as a pack member, no special rank, no power over others, simply a member among members. Or he could leave. He chose to leave. Ro went with him. The days that followed were not dramatic. There were no celebrations, no ceremonies with torches and speeches. There was simply the quiet, steady work of rebuilding something that had been damaged for a long time. Elias held open meetings, something the pack had not experienced in living memory. He listened more than he spoke. He asked the senior members to help reorganize the rank structure so that no designation could be used to degrade a person. He sat with the elders, with the younger wolves, with the people who had been too afraid to say anything for years. It was slow. It was sometimes frustrating. It was the most alive he had ever felt. Marin stayed close during those early weeks. She guided him through things she knew and stepped back from things she did not. One evening, sitting at her small table with 2 cups of tea between them, she apologized again, properly this time, with full weight behind the words. Elias listened. He nodded. Then he said, "I'm not going to tell you it was fine. It wasn't. But you kept me alive, and I'm here. I'll work with what I have." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. A small, tired, real smile. "You always did," she said. 3 months after the night of the full moon, Elias walked the eastern border of Shadow Vale at dusk. It was a habit he had kept from his old life, the nightly perimeter check that used to be his punishment, his lowest task, the one assigned to him specifically because it was unpleasant and lonely. He still did it, not because he had to, but because he had come to like the quiet of it, the way the forest smelled in the early evening, the sound of the wind in the trees, the feeling of the territory under his feet. He reached the eastern tree line and stopped. He stood there for a moment, looking into the forest. Then he shifted. The change came the way it always did now, easy, natural, like water finding its level. The great silver wolf stepped forward where the man had been, and for a while, it simply stood in the silence, breathing the night air. Then it ran. It ran along the border, through the trees, over the soft ground of the territory. Not because it was chasing something, not because it was running from anything, simply because this was its ground, and the ground was worth knowing, and the night was long and quiet and full of good things. Somewhere far behind him, the packhouse lights glowed warm and yellow in the growing dark. His people were there, resting, eating, talking, sleeping safely. That was what it was all for. Not power, not recognition, not the satisfaction of having proven something to the people who had once looked through him as if he were not there. It was simply this: a pack that was safe, a territory that was whole, a life that was finally, fully, his own. He had spent 22 years being treated like nothing, like a mistake, like a burden that the world would eventually shake off. But the world had been wrong about him from the very beginning. He had never been nothing. He had always been this. He just had to survive long enough for the truth to find its way out.